We've asked for that core. Okay. Which part of it, we're just also confused about what the base project is, because I think, I understand that 25 million is supposed to be the base project, but I think I see you. It's nothing, it has to be completely like a project, so you have to actually filter. Because my understanding is how they had the real script anyway. They were doing the original running by other artists. Artists. So any and they I think they mentioned the GHG we care about when so I know they said 25 million, and then and then that is right now for the mature trees and the asphalt that would be pulling out. So we don't know where the other 25 is going to be. I mean, like trying to get, like our email last night, and we were trying to get, we wanted a template from some sort of
All right. Good afternoon. All right. Welcome to the October meeting of the Strategic Growth Council. Why don't we start on my far left with roll. Matt, do you want to start us off?
I'm here.
Hi, Jenny Lester Moffett, filling in for Secretary Ross.
Manuel Bastard, public member, filling in for Manuel Bastard, public member.
Bob Fisher, public member.
Ken Alex, Office of Planning and Research.
Lynn Von Koch-Liebert, Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, filling in for Secretary Podesta.
Michael Flad, filling in for no one, and appointee of Anthony Rendon, Speaker of the Assembly.
Here.
That's okay. I'm Diana Dooley, Health and Human Services Agency.
John Laird, Natural Resources Agency.
Brian Annis, representing Secretary Brian Kelly from the Transportation Agency.
Okay, welcome everybody. The highlight of every meeting for me, approval of the minutes. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor of approving the minutes say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes are unanimously approved. All right, and now any council member updates? Anything people want to report? I'm seeing none, so I am going to the consent calendar. Randall.
And we are on. Excellent. So good afternoon, council members. Usually we move relatively quickly here through our consent calendar items, but given the complexity of the two items and some of the feedback received, I didn't want to spend a moment here just reviewing what you have before you. So two items here as part of the consent calendar. The first being a technical amendment to the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. As the council members may recall, SGC did move to include the August auction proceeds as part of the current notice of funding availability for the program. That increases the funding amount for this year, which we are excited to do, by $100 million approximately, up to approximately $255 million. And that technical amendment that is before you needs to be made given an update needed to CARB's, the Air Resources Board, GHG quantification methodology in line with 17-18 funding. The second set of amendments here, technical amendments rather, are to the Transformative Climate Communities Program guidelines. Now, as you all recall, we approved the guidelines for this year for the TCC program back in August. And at the time, we knew that certain elements of those guidelines would need to be would need to have further clarification provided due to an ongoing and now updated funding guidelines from the Air Resources Board. There were three areas chiefly where we needed to provide further clarity, and we've done so here. One is in workforce development and training costs. The second is in community engagement costs. And the third is actually an FAQ that responds to questions that were raised throughout our application process related to AHSC project types. Now, all of that being said, we did receive a good amount of feedback, and I think I want to recognize here, both for the council and the public, that some of these changes coming quickly create unintended burdens just because you have applicants in the middle of an application process and our staff trying to communicate quickly in those changes that are being made. None of the changes will affect scoring. And you'll have I notice you have a few letters here from public stakeholders, each of whom we've been in touch with, including LA Metro, City of Fresno, Councilmember Marquise Harris Dawson's office, regarding some of the eligible and ineligible costs. I just want to say, in response to each of those letters, and again, after speaking with each of those letter authors, SGC staff is going to work with all of these entities to work through costs that may have been seen as ineligible in our proposed technical amendments, both from concept proposal to full application for this program to work out some of those challenges. Again, we understand that this is a complex program, and maybe more so even than other programs, our staff is committed to continuing to work with applicants. So wanted to provide some additional clarity there, and happy to answer any questions.
Let me ask a procedural question. Can we divide the consent calendar in two and have two separate discussions or votes?
That's correct.
Does anybody know?
Well, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
usually the consent calendar is consent, so there's no discussion at all. So what you might do is pull it off to discuss it and then approve
Okay.
it and approve whatever you leave on.
Okay, I think we need to do that because we have some public comments on part two. So let's do this. Let's,
Would you like a motion to approve part one on consent?
that would be great.
I move that.
And do I hear a second?
I'll second.
All right. So on the consent calendar as it has been reconstituted, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, that passes unanimously. That's indicated right now on the agenda as 5A. Now, let's... I'm going to have to work through my Latin phrases for this, but...
I'm amazed you've lasted 7 years under this governor and you have not perfected your Latin phrases.
It's the only reason I've survived. All right, so now we have 5B, which is no longer on the consent calendar, but is an action item for discussion. So maybe the way we should do this is to have a motion on this item as well, and then proceed with the discussion.
I would move it.
Do I hear a second? I'll second. All right, we have a motion and a second. And we have some, more than two, we have a number of requests. It's become very popular to comment on 5B. So let's go forward and have public comment on this item, starting with Brady Borcherding, followed by Robert Naylor.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Brady Borcherding on behalf of Assemblymember Bocanegra. I don't have any Latin to offer, unfortunately, but I'll keep my comments brief. We were just here to echo some concerns that have been raised by folks in our district who are submitting a grant to the DCC program about the cap of 5% of the grant money towards community outreach funds. We have a district that's very dense, an urban area, as well as a commuter district, which may make community outreach events and planning difficult. And as difficulty increases, so does the expense. And as we know that educating the public on implementation sides of this grant is integral to its adoption and long-term success, we urge the committee to, or the council rather, to consider changing the 5% cap to something more like 8 to 10 or 12%. Thank you.
Okay, excuse me, Robert Naylor, followed by Jessica Medina.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members, Robert Naylor, representing the LA Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Well done procedurally, Secretary Laird, to pull this off. We submitted our proposal in following the initial guidelines, and we find some of the changes to the guidelines to be anything but technical, especially excluding pre-construction activities, which includes environmental, final design, planning, and those pre-construction activities are key to community coordination. So one of the whole ideas of this grant is to involve the community in a serious way before a capital project is proposed. It's about a $4 million item that has been struck from as a result of changing these guidelines. So we just think that this ought to be reconsidered, not just adopted willy-nilly today after very short notice and after the initial grant requests are already submitted. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jessica Medina, followed by Malcolm Harris.
Good afternoon. I was in the middle of writing my notes for my public comment. So thank you all for having us. We've submitted a comment letter earlier in the week when the proposal was for a 5% cap, as somebody just mentioned. And do want to acknowledge that we appreciate the change to a 5 to 8% range, but we would still really like to see that ceiling be a little bit higher. I think in our latest letter, we advocated for a 10% ceiling, but what we're hearing from other climate equity advocates across the state is that it should be 15%, if not higher. Yes, I know. But, and that's really just to ensure that the budgets from this program's at the scale that they're supposed to be implemented at, and with the range in communities. For example, for us in South LA, we have a much more dense community across 5 square miles than maybe other parts of the city, and definitely than other parts of the state. And so budget parity, I think, with a broader range would allow us to really meet the local needs of our community and to determine locally with our partners kind of what is the budget that is actually needed to make sure that this transformation is community driven and includes a majority of stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm followed. Well, I have 2 comments that have identified 5A, but I actually think you want 5B. So I'm gonna assume that until you tell me otherwise. So Rico Mastrodonato is on deck after Malcolm.
So that's Malcolm first, and then.
Yes, Malcolm Harris.
Hi, Malcolm Harris, LA Equity Alliance, Trust South LA. In 1950, the Los Angeles Sentinel, which is an African-American paper in LA, asked folks on the street, what are the biggest issues for folks moving back and forth in South Central LA? And this was on a street called Central Avenue, which crosses Slauson. It connects Watts to downtown. And the biggest issue that folks pointed out were their concerns about the lack of adequate transportation, the lack of buses that would connect folks from Watts to downtown, and that would connect folks to opportunity, meaning to jobs in the west side of Los Angeles. This was in 1950, 15 years before Watts. At the time, that Central Avenue community was mostly African Americans and other physically black folks who had come from the South to California. And the issues that we saw were 15 years later, the 25% unemployment, the concerns about the lack of infrastructure development were directly could be connected to the Watts Rebellion. 25 to 30 years later, we could probably connect those issues to 1992 and the Los Angeles civil unrest. Almost 25 years later, we can connect those issues to the many issues that we still see that that impact South LA, but is recognizable around the country, and particularly in communities that look like South LA, which are communities that historically our majority are sizable black populations and communities, along with mostly immigrant Latino communities. So we point this out to create a historical context that this is nothing new. The historical marginalization of poor communities, particularly black and brown communities, is an old issue. And the beautiful thing about this project is it creates the opportunity to get in front of that. South Central LA is dense. Like most poor communities throughout the state and the country, it is dense. And it connects 2 corridors in the particular project that we're working on, which connects Slauson Avenue to what's considered the east side of South Central LA and the west side of South Central LA. And our concerns is that in this project, this is an opportunity to create hope and the opportunity for investment and safeguards and to be able to stop this generational marginalization and displacement of communities, and also the potential for shared prosperity and building healthier families and stronger communities and neighborhoods. And we see that this opportunity, this funding opportunity, can also create a multi-layered strategy that could leverage the opportunity for future funding to be able to right these wrongs and for us to be able to build stronger communities, stronger neighborhood, and stronger families. We appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this, and we ask that SGC continue to look at the potential of funding robustly our communities. Thanks.
Thank you. Rico, followed by Yvette. Lopez Ledesma, it looks like.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. Rico Mastrodonato with the Trust for Public Land. I'm joining the chorus of other equity advocates with regard to the cap on community engagement. We think community engagement, in our experience, is the key to successful projects, to buy-in from the community, reflection of the community, and it's expensive to do that. We have to be able to cover childcare, transportation costs, food, et cetera. And we also would like to see a minimum of 10% and maybe a range, but we strongly believe 5% is too low. Thank you.
Thank you. Yvette, followed by Tiffany Ng.
Hi, good afternoon, board members and staff. My name is Yvette Lopez Ledesma, Deputy Director at Pacoima Beautiful. And for the past year, our organization and our partners from the Trust for Public Land, Grid Alternatives, the Los Angeles Business Council, UCLA, and the LA Conservation Corps have been developing and working on developing our Green Together Northeast San Fernando Valley project proposal for this opportunity. We appreciate the opportunity to engage and provide feedback on guidelines and amendments. We too also would agree that the cap is low and a range would be much appreciated. You know, our organization dedicates itself to engaging the public in these robust planning processes, and we cannot understate the value of this type of outreach for projects. And, you know, placing a cap that is low, whether it be 5 or 8%, it kind of undermines the work that it takes to do this kind of planning and this kind of project development. So we see that as a major need. A range would be greatly appreciated. Also, another challenge for us working to engage the community are the eligible costs under the community engagement outreach cost. Childcare, food and refreshment should be eligible for many people in top 5 and 10 coronavirus screen communities. Attending public meetings is a challenge, so allowing for those costs as eligible would generate a public participation that is more robust and takes into account the lives of those that are being impacted directly by these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiffany Ng, followed by Andrew Antwi.
Hi, good afternoon. Tiffany Ng with the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Just wanted to reiterate our thanks for working with SGC Council and staff to really develop a really strong program with the Transformative Climate Communities Program. The feedback and information from SGC staff has been really great. I think in the future, I know that people are rushing to get out the guidelines and to inform applicants on the the rules for the guidelines and the applications, but we would in the future would love a little bit more time to give feedback if possible, since we know that it does actually have a lot of bearing on applicants' proposals. But again, we are really excited for this program to roll out. We've really lifted up TCC as a great model for community engagement. From the guideline development process to the rollout, we think it's been something that a lot of different state programs can learn from, and we really want to make sure that we advocate for it in 2018. On that note, we do want to echo everyone else who has mentioned the need to raise the cap for community engagement. I don't want to belabor the point, but we do feel like it's really important, not only for the groups that are trying to get more people involved in their program, but the fact that if we do want to reduce GHGs and get more people to do modal shifts and to get involved in the trails and transportation projects, we do think robust community engagement is really needed and really needs to be fully funded. So as much as possible, hope that you can consider that change, and we look forward to continuing to lift up TCC as a good model for community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you, council members. Andrew Antwi here today on behalf of the City of Los Angeles, specifically Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. We're here to express support for the grant proposals and the proposal process that's been administered by the Growth Council. There's 3 projects from community partners in the City of Los Angeles, specifically historically underserved parts of the City of Los Angeles, including the communities of Pacoima, Sun Valley, South Los Angeles, and Watts. The projects specifically are Green Together, Northeast Valley Project, Rail to River, in the South Los Angeles area of Los Angeles is specifically a TCC project, and then there's a project from the community of Watts. The mayor's office supports all of these project applications from community partners And we also, on behalf of certain council districts, share some of the concerns that have been expressed specifically related to pre-construction activities not being allowed, or and then also outreach being capped. But generally, we'd like to add on behalf of the mayor's office that the process and the framework for the guidelines pretty much tracks with the city of Los Angeles, their sustainable plan, city plan, which was released 2 years ago. We have goals within the city of Los Angeles of reducing the number of census tracts in the top 10% of our EnviroScreen areas within this Los Angeles, and taking emissions below our 1990 baselines, and a few other goals. And there are also city departments, including Department of Water and Power, Bureau of Sanitation, LADOT, and the Bureau of Street Services that are all partners in one or more of these projects. And so with those goals and the concerns, we commend approval and consideration of the concerns that have been expressed. Thank you.
Thank you. The council is eventually going to have to choose among those three. So at some point, it may not get the full support, but we'll see. Randall, if you could talk to the two key issues, the 8% and the pre-construction, and then we'll open it up to the council.
And happy to, and thank you for the comments from the public as well. So on that first issue, just to provide clarity to the council and what's before you, the technical proposed, again, in response to some of the concerns that we've heard over the past week, for community engagement costs and eligible costs, we are stating that there is approximately 5 to 8%, and there is not a cap on 8%. The Strategic Growth Council staff recognizes that every project is unique. This is the first time for a GGRF program that really cuts across all the projects, that we're trying to come up with the right number with regard to community engagement costs. We work closely with ARB in determining that number, but when it comes down to it, between the phase of concept proposal and full application, we've allowed flexibility to be able to, if we believe that the project warrants it, move beyond that 8%, but again, assessing it on a project-by-project basis, given the very unique nature we know of the proposals coming forth. So it's not, again, the range that we're stating for community engagement criteria is 5 to 8%, but we're also giving staff flexibility to go beyond that depending upon the nature of the project as we dig into them further. That's point number one. Second, on pre-construction costs, and a very good point raised, and let me just unpack how we've addressed that. So what was now deemed ineligible in the guidelines are the pre-construction costs associated with the active transportation program. Now, TCC as a sort of this cross-cutting program is really an assemblage of these numerous project types associated with transportation, and you're all fully aware of them: active transportation, low carbon transit operations, transit rail and intercity capital, to name a few. Each of those have different readiness requirements and requirements for funding or what can't be funded. We've gone through a process to try to sort of match all of those up, and admittedly, I think when we first released the guidelines, and again, as ARB was updating their guidelines, some of those changes we needed to make to adjust to the update of the funding guidelines, which is why you see some of the changes specifically to the active transportation program. However, the pre-construction costs that were mentioned in the comment can be covered by other project types. What that means is that when we meet with and speak further with each of the applicants who submitted concept proposals, we are going to work with them on their budgets, on their costs, and both pre-construction and capital costs, both for what was available previously under active transportation, might be available under another project type, to make sure that those are kept whole. So it's really just sort of a moving around of those costs to different project types. It is certainly complex. We are still, I think, figuring out how the different project types operate when they meet the ground of actual proposals, and it's why we're sort of, I think, seeing some of the challenge. So we appreciate the patience, and certainly on the part of the public. This is an area that we're going to continue to work closely with our applicants on.
Let me ask you a couple of leading questions to see if I've got this. Our guidelines are intended to reflect some of the constraints and limitations of the guidelines for the projects, for other projects where our program overlaps. Is that right?
That is correct.
And on active transportation, the rules are such that some of the pre-construction costs that we had originally thought were available are not under that program. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and so what you're saying is that on a project-by-project basis, because we know these applications were in the middle with our guidelines, that if there's a situation where some of the funds may be cut out as a result of this change, you'll work carefully with the applicant to make sure that they're not at a disadvantage as a result.
That is correct.
Okay. Any questions, comments from the council? Manuel.
So 2 comments, I guess. One is on the issue of the target with regard to funding for community engagement. It's something that I was very concerned about too, brought to my attention by community groups, but expressed my own set of concerns about it. I think when many of us were thinking about transformative climate communities, we were thinking about transformative communities and how it is that the act of engagement in these processes will help devise better solutions and also lead to changes in behavior around biking, walking, et cetera, that really rely on community engagement for that transformation to take place. And having been in touch with several of the processes rolling forward in LA and the one in Fresno, the community engagement piece has been transformative for those groups. So I think it's really critical. I would support 5 to 10%. I think there's a lot of forces cutting in different kinds of ways. I think it's very important to underline that the 8% top target that you're putting there is not necessarily a cap, that people can and should, if it makes sense, make the case for spending what's necessary to engage communities fully in this process, because that's part of what I think the authors of the legislation wanted. I think it's what a lot of the groups that have worked so hard on this along the way have wanted, is to ensure that community engagement. So that's comment number 1, and thanks for listening in the last couple of panicky days to at least move away from 5%. And then second, I think it is very important that with regard to the other issue, that no proposal be penalized for having operated under a, and you've said it, but I'm just kind of saying it again, that no proposal be penalized for operating under a set of guidelines that they thought were operative when they were preparing their budgets. And that we should do everything we can, if it's a good proposal and scores well on everything else, that should have no impact on the scoring that takes place. So flexibility, even above the 8% on the community engagement, and making sure that nobody gets penalized for their budgeting under what they thought were the guidelines are 2 concerns I'd be bringing forward as a public member. And I do want to thank Randall, though, for being quite flexible in the last week or so as these issues have come up.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Laird?
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? If the motion that's in front of us passes, does that limit you from doing the 2 things that were just mentioned by Mr. Pastor?
I don't believe so.
So if you want to have the flexibility of 5 to 10%, or the other thing he said, that could be done embodied in the existing proposal if we pass it.
That is correct.
Okay.
Other questions or comments?
If I can make a completely nonsensical comment, which would be totally unique. I noticed that Mr. Naylor made a comment, and he was the he was the minority leader in the assembly when Willie Brown was the speaker, and he said he didn't like things being done willy-nilly. And so I've been searching for deeper meaning ever since he said that, and I will consult him later for that deeper meaning.
Okay, on that high note.
Anybody else that wanted to mess with the motion has forgotten it.
So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, it passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Moving on to the Executive Director's report.
All right, thank you again, council members. We'll wait till this comes up here. So we'll try to move here pretty quickly between the executive or through the executive report to get to a couple of items that we have on our agenda today. So some updates on activities and communications and a few other important programmatic updates. And we'll follow that with a quick legislative report following the end of our legislative session here just over this past month. So quickly, by way of just an update on our activities and communications, I wanted to note a couple of conferences, importantly, that have taken place here over the past month. Chair Alex and I had a chance to deliver a rousing welcome to the APA, or the American Planning Association Conference. Just this past week, I did want to highlight past couple of weeks, a California Climate Equity Coalition meeting where a number of departments heads here from our member agencies took part, really looking at the year ahead in the area of equity, noting SB 350, AB 617, and of course our climate change programs and how we'll be collaborating closely with our advocates and other stakeholders in approaching each of those items of legislation and otherwise. We formed a new steering committee here that was kicked off just a couple of weeks ago on outreach and technical assistance. It'll be chaired by the SGC and the Air Resources Board. This is focusing not just on SGC's technical assistance and outreach program, but also, again, SB 350 and the outreach efforts associated with that law that was passed some time ago, and then, of course, AB 617 and the technical assistance that would take place through the Community Air Protection Program. We'll also be having a convening here in the next few weeks on workforce development. I want to note that TCC in particular is sort of bridging it into a new area with regard to how we're reporting and quantifying on workforce development as it relates to our climate investments. And we saw it fit to work with the Labor and Workforce Development Agency as well as the Workforce Investment Board to convene a meeting here in workforce development next month. We're also redesigning SGC's website. It has been some time, and I want to thank our Vice Chair, Bob Fisher, for a conversation I think that we had some months ago now about your thoughts on how to redesign the website and kind of make it more slimmed down and focus in on what we do. You can expect to see that redesign in early January of 2018. Also wanted to point to a couple of new staff. So I think our council has met them already, but we do have a new deputy director, Marlene De La O. And for those in the room who have not met Marlene, please do so. And then over at OPR, but also supporting the Strategic Growth Council, a new legislative analyst, Natalie Cuffle, who you hear from here pretty shortly. So I'll run through these slides relatively quickly, but again, our public member, Vice Chair Bob Fisher, asked that we just display here the range of programs and funding sources, at least across our climate investments, that we now currently have. Our council members should be familiar with these, but I did want to share them with you all. We have our Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which now has the August auction proceeds added to them. Our Sustainable Agricultural Lands and Conservation program. You'll hear award recommendations to the council next, or rather in January, again, with the addition of August auction proceeds. Transformative Climate Communities program, which you all know about. We've also received an additional $10 million for Transformative Climate Communities for 17-18 funding, and we'll be bringing forth options or a discussion on that at our next council meeting, our outreach and technical assistance program, and then what you'll hear about a little bit later today, our new climate change research program. So I wanted to again review our set of funding sources and programs as it grows, and happy to answer any questions after the presentation. A few key updates also that I wanted to share. Our Health and All Policies Task Force will be launching and got approval for funding from an outside source here. Government Alliance on Race and Equity. This is going to provide training to departments and agencies who would like to sign up. There'll be an info session on October 30th here. I know our council member Manuel Pastor has been involved, as well as others. Both the Housing and Community Development Department, as well as the California Department of Public Health, have undertaken cohorts themselves, and just a couple of quotes there that you all can take a look at, but can certainly offer words of advice and lessons as other departments consider whether or not to take that on. So it should be an exciting endeavor. An update on a few programs here. So the best practices pilot, to remind our council members, these were our remaining Prop 84 funds that went to fund, along with, our partner, the Office of Planning and Research, a number of best practices planning efforts. You see the list of projects here that were funded, and again, those were mentioned earlier this year. We'll be expecting to complete these projects by 2018, so before the end of the administration. And the timing is good because as these best practices pilots are underway, as you all know, the general plan guidelines, the new general plan guidelines have been released, as well as a host of other funding opportunities that these best practices could take advantage of, including SB1 transportation grants, our climate investments, the new housing legislative package, which you'll hear about shortly. And on transformative climate communities, did want to share the 7 proposals, concept proposals that we've received. Again, I know many of our council members are aware of this due to letters received. We have the City of Fresno, 3 from the City of Los Angeles, City of Ontario, County of Riverside, and Sacramento. Full applications are due on November 30th, and we'll be making award recommendations to the council in January 2018. So with that, we'll turn it over to Natalie.
So I have a quick question for you. You and I received communication from the former mayor of Fresno over the weekend. I wonder if you might want to mention that, because it connects to our work with Fresno on a number of fronts.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that reminder, Chair Alex. Over the weekend, the city of Fresno was happy to announce that they were kind of blowing up all the social media with the opening of the Fulton Mall, which even prior to SGC's involvement with TCC, I know Chair Alex and a number of staff were heavily involved in kind of building on the general plan update. There were street parties, literally, rooftop parties, and I think it was an incredible moment of the community coming together, because it was also on the heels of advocates and leadership coming together around the Transformative Climate Communities proposal. So I think it was an indication of the momentum that is underway in Fresno, and we certainly look forward to staying closely involved both through our investment and beyond. So thank you for that, Chair Alex.
And I think Lynn has a comment.
Yes.
Yes. As you mentioned, Randall, Housing and Community Development was one of the pioneer participants in the GAR program, and we just wanted to emphasize the value that we found in that program for the department, as well as the utility that we've had in being able to implement elements of that in our planning. So we would encourage other departments to also reach out to the HIAP people and consider enrolling in that as well.
Thank you for that, Lynn. And one quick comment on that. We are working closely with the Government Operations Agency and Cal HR, Human Resources, and we'll be following up with a number of your departments here for some closer discussions. So appreciate you sharing that.
And because I failed on my Latin, I would be remiss if I didn't say the governor really hates acronyms. So if we can sometimes say what GAR means, that would be helpful. Exactly.
The Government Alliance on Race and Equity. Thank you for that, Chair. Any other questions or comments?
Oh, Manuel.
I just wanted to put in a good word for GARE. My expression, my expression before was dare to GARE. But I think it's a very innovative program because what it's trying to do is to lift some of the best thinking around racial disparities and equity into the public sector. A lot of times that gets infused into the social movement sector, gets infused into academy, but so much of what really makes a difference in people's lives is the way in which the public sector implements policy. And having government officials be aware of issues of racial disparity and remedies is quite powerful. And I've worked with through GARE, a number of city governments, for example, Long Beach, that are really pushing ahead, and they seem to have benefited greatly from this. So anyone who's in some of the state agencies and wants to have a good time, dare to GARE.
Thank you, Dr. Pastorin, for iterating that acronym. Sorry, Chair.
Thanks.
All right, Natalie?
Hi, thank you. So as Randall mentioned, AB 109, which was part of the Cap and Trade package, amended the Budget Act of 2017 and allotted new money for SGC, 10 million for the TCC program, and then 11 million to fund research on carbon emissions, which you'll hear about in Agenda Item 8. While there were multiple bills referencing SGC that were introduced this year, most stalled in the legislative process and did not actually get out of the legislature. The one that did, AB 863, was ultimately vetoed by the governor. The bill would have encouraged projects that receive AHSC funding to employ local entrepreneurs and workers in training programs. And in the veto message, the governor stated that the AHSC program already does have a focus on improving economic conditions within disadvantaged communities, and the guidelines actually prioritize projects already that focus on local entrepreneurs and workforce training programs. So any other amendments that were needed to put more emphasis on this could be done through the SGC process and did not need to go through the legislature. Was the governor's reasoning. And in terms of next session, a lot of those bills that were brought forth this year that reference SGC could be brought back. We'll keep an eye on that when the legislature reconvenes in January and then see if there's any new bills that are introduced.
You're saying the SGC is the kiss of death.
You know, it makes my job a lot easier. So.
Thanks, Natalie.
No problem.
We have a public comment on this item, so Juliet Sims.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and representing the field of public health, I'm struck all the acronyms from my comments. Our field is rife with them as well. So I'm representing Prevention Institute. We are a national nonprofit based here in California, dedicated to advancing community health and well-being in the first place. And I just wanted to extend our strong support for the launch of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity Sacramento cohort. This effort really connects Sacramento with a national movement that's currently taking place towards strengthening the capacity to address racial inequities through systems and policy change efforts. We know that over 35 California jurisdictions have participated in similar efforts so far, and it's terrific to see the state joining that. Prevention Institute recently underwent a research project where we actually had a chance to interview communities that were doing these sorts of efforts. And what we really heard was that it strengthened the capacity and skills of government leadership to really think about systems efforts. And it also increased the ability for communities and for governments to meaningfully engage and work together. Strategic Growth Council is already really a model in terms of championing systems and place-based solutions, and we really feel like this is going to help expand that approach and strengthen it within the state as well. So thanks so much for the chance to comment.
Thank you very much. Okay, I guess, Lynn, you're up next on item 7, the housing legislation from the last session.
Thank you for inviting us to speak. This has been an exciting year for housing, and we're very pleased to provide an overview of this legislative package that has been passed this season. So as you're all very aware, California is facing a daunting housing affordability challenge. Over the last decade, housing production did not keep pace with the need for housing. Home ownership is at its lowest rate since the 1940s. We estimate that 1.8 million new homes are needed by 2025 to accommodate growth. In response, on September 29th, Governor Brown signed a 15-bill package of legislation designed to ease the housing crunch. In 2017, Governor Brown outlined 5 housing policy principles that the legislative package now seeks to achieve: dedicated funding, streamlining housing development, incentivizing housing production, accountability enforcement, and lower costs of housing development. The 2017 housing package is the most ambitious step the state has taken in decades and aligns very closely with the stated policy principles. For the sake of time, I will just highlight a few, but the full list is included in these slides. Okay. Within dedicated funding, Senate Bill 2, the Jobs and Homes Act, will provide an ongoing source of funding for affordable housing estimated to generate $250 million annually. Funds will be generated from a $75 fee on recording of specified real estate documents. Funds will be available for new and the preservation of existing affordable homes. Senate Bill 3, also known as the Veterans and Affordable Housing Bond Act, places a $4 billion general obligation bond on the November 2018 general ballot. $3 billion of this funding will recapitalize existing Proposition 1C programs with track records of assistance for development, preservation, and rehabilitation of affordable housing and matching grants for local housing trust funds and home ownership programs. The remaining $1 billion in bond proceeds will be for the CalVet administered home and farm purchase assistance for veterans. In terms of streamlining housing development, Senate Bill 35, the Housing Accountability and Affordability Act, streamlines the approval process for qualifying infill developments in local communities that have failed to meet their share of the regional housing needs assessment. And Senate Bill 540 authorizes planning funds for cities and counties to adopt specific plans for designated areas with affordable housing requirements that minimizing environmental review. In the accountability and enforcement, I want to highlight AB 72, which strengthens the enforcement of state housing planning law and authorizes HCD to refer violations to the Attorney General, giving housing and community development real teeth. Next slide. In terms of incentivizing housing production, AB 73 allows cities and counties with streamlined zoning with affordable housing requirements to qualify for state financial incentives and technical assistance, and AB 571 makes California's farm worker housing tax credit more attractive to developers. And finally, lower costs of housing development. AB 879 authorizes a study on locally mandated impact fees pursuant to the Migration Fee Act to substantially reduce fees for residential development. This proposal is due in 2019. So in terms of next steps, 2 departments in our agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development and California Housing and Finance Agency, are working quickly to prepare for implementation of the new statute. Legislature continues to evaluate the existing challenges, and we hope that 2007 will serve as a launch pad for continued progress. Our agency would like to compliment the senators and the assembly members who put forward bills. Over 120 bills were put forward this session, underpinning the necessity and highlighting the will for change in this space. Thanks also to the many stakeholders who stayed engaged and worked with the government to ensure the best policy solution. And thanks to our departments, HCD and CalHFA, who provided technical assistance and who stand ready to implement these many housing bills. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, comments for Lynn? All right. Well, we probably haven't quite solved the housing crisis, but it's obviously a good start for the state. All right. Item number 8. Louise, you're up.
Great. Well, thank you all. I'm going to give an overview of the research program that was allocated to SGC this summer. Just a discussion item for now, so hopefully we'll launch some questions and conversation about the direction of the program. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I'll just talk through the direction that was given in the legislation. And then Randall asked if I could give a snapshot of the current research landscape. So very high level, I'll go through some of what the state has been doing, touch a tiny bit on what's happening outside of the state, and then talk about some of the gaps that are emerging just from that review and conversation. And then end with our proposed process and timeline, which I should say is very much a straw man and one we'd like input and thoughts on. So just as Natalie mentioned, Assembly Bill 109 gave $11 million to SGC to be used to fund research on reducing carbon emissions, including clean energy, adaptation, and resiliency, with an emphasis on California. It went on to specify eligible applicants to be UC, CSU, federally funded research labs, and private universities and colleges, nonprofit universities and colleges, and then specifies the money should be distributed through a competitive award process and directs SGC to develop a research investment plan to guide the program. So those are really the requirements. A few things I would just note. $11 million is not a large amount of money when it comes to research, particularly when thinking about applied research in the clean energy field. And so as we've been approaching this, we've really been trying to think about how we can use that money to leverage and build on existing state investments, fill gaps, and really take advantage of the role of SGC as a multi-agency body. So good news, we're not starting from scratch. In 2015, California, through the Climate Action Team Research Working Group, developed a climate change research plan for the state. And this was developed through the state agency climate action team process, but also through public engagement and a series of public workshops. It identified research gaps, needs, and priorities for the next 3 to 5 years. And it goes through monitoring, modeling, and analysis. So what do we need in terms of how we model climate impacts, how we keep track of change that's happening on the ground. Also went through research needs for greenhouse gas emission reductions and needs to support safeguarding California and adaptation and resiliency, and then identifies a whole suite of cross-cutting topics. The research plan, while developed across as a collaborative process across agencies and departments, was really intended to be a guidance document for the implementation through individual department and agency research programs. And so we've seen all of these items being implemented through those efforts, and I'll walk through what some of those are. But first I'll talk about, I won't read everything on here, don't worry. I just wanted to give a sense of some of the research priority areas that were identified in the plan. And so they really focused on monitoring climate impacts. So how do we understand the change that is happening? How do we track it? Also on climate projections, how do we get better at developing information about the likely or potential impacts of climate change on the state at a scale that's relevant for planning and decision making? And that can really then feed into efforts to safeguard California and support risk-based decision-making. It also calls out the need for studying integrated actions, so policies, programs that would both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help to prepare for climate impacts. Calls out the need to understand socioeconomic effects, both of policies, but of how impacts are going to affect different people differently, to look at jobs, vulnerability, and so looking really in a more socioeconomic space. Many research questions to further refine and inform our policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but then also how we account for emissions. So thinking about improving our methods for how we track and inventory greenhouse gas emissions from various sources. And so what have we accomplished? And this is really just a snapshot, but I'll walk through a couple of things. First, climate impacts, understanding projected climate impacts. This is a snapshot from CalAdapt, the state's tool to communicate and provide access to downscaled climate projection data. This shows projected increase in average temperature in Sacramento over the coming century. This is a result of our new downscaled climate projections that the California Energy Commission has invested in producing. We have a new methodology that was developed, that scripts, that is now being used at the national scale. And so these data are available for the entire state at a scale that is relevant to decision makers and is available for download and viewing through CalAdapt. And so that was, and that is also the basis for our fourth climate assessment, which I will talk about later. And the methodology, for those who are interested, is called LOCA. So if you hear people talk about it, and it is, as I said, being now used in the National Climate Assessment as well, which is great. So building off of those projections, we also have produced quasi-probabilistic estimates of sea level rise. So what does that mean? It means that we've taken our climate data and we've been able to start to develop probabilistic estimates. So how likely is it that we will exceed X amount of sea level rise by a certain date, and have developed that through a science working group that was part of the Ocean Protection Council's science advisory team to produce this report, Rising Seas in California. And other jurisdictions have done this as well, but this is going to serve as the basis for the update to the state's sea level rise guidance document. And so this is really speaking to decision support and taking those projections and making them very useful and applicable to our guidance development. One more I'll mention, which is coming this fall, is we will have an update to our climate change indicators for California that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment will be producing. But again, just building on gathering information to understand and track climate impacts. And this report has been really important for helping to inform change that is happening, things we need to understand more. And so looking forward to an update of that. And then I think probably one of our biggest, most comprehensive undertakings following the research plan development has been the launch of the state's fourth comprehensive climate change assessment. And this got underway about 18 months ago. It's being funded through two funding streams, one flowing through the California Energy Commission and one through the California Natural Resources Agency. We very technically refer to the energy studies and the non-energy studies, but really the California Energy Commission's work is focused on really understanding climate impacts, so looking at those downscaled climate projections I mentioned, as well as wildfire, extreme events, and really producing a lot of information that underlies studies, energy sector and beyond. But then their technical reports are really focusing on vulnerability and adaptation in the energy sector, both electricity, so generation, transmission, and then also natural gas. All of that information is being integrated into CalAdapt. So all of our energy sector findings are being presented in that tool. The California Natural Resources Agency is funding a suite of 16 technical studies. Like I said, it's very hard to describe something as what it is not, but really rounding out the portfolio of work to bring in other sectors. So coasts, habitat, agriculture, and really doing a whole suite of sector-specific implementation studies, but also looking at barriers to adaptation, adaptation financing, and starting to look into some of those socioeconomic issues as well. I should also say, for the fourth climate assessment, in addition to the state's investment, which all told is around $10 million for these about 34, 35 technical studies, we have about 15 or 16 in-kind external contributions to the assessment That's researchers who have been funded through foundations, federal grants, just any other source that are contributing their findings to the assessment to further round out and provide depth in different areas. So all told, we will have about 50 studies, technical studies, as part of the assessment. We also have a team of volunteer authors who are producing a series of regional reports, which will take all of these findings and summarize them down to a regional scale for 9 regions around California. And so that work is really intended to provide about a 30 to 40 page document that can be useful at a regional scale to talk about what are the impacts of concern, how does it affect that local regional economy, the people, et cetera. And all of that is being contributed by volunteers across the academic sector, and they're all informed by stakeholder advisory groups. So the climate assessment, of course, is a huge piece of how we're implementing the research plan. And now I'll talk through some of the specific research programs at a very high level. I am not an expert in all of them by any means, but we have been in the process of trying to sit down with all of the different state agencies to understand current research investments, planned research investments, how this program can complement them, how they work with other programs, and that is a conversation that will continue as we implement this program. So through the Climate Action Team Research Working Group, but then also probably through some type of a steering committee or working group that we'll create to bring folks together as this moves forward. So of course, the California Air Resources Board has a robust research program. In 2017-18, they have about $4 million that they're investing in 6 topic areas. This is the research plan, which they adopted earlier this year. 2 particularly relevant programs here or areas of study include their investments in sustainable communities and then also in climate program support. So these are some of the projects they will be supporting. They also will be investing about $1 million of that $4 million in environmental justice focused work. And these 2 programs then account for about $1.4 million of investment. And so we've been talking with the Air Resources Board to learn more about these projects, but then also learn a lot about their implementation and how they move forward with doing the work and bringing in experts, et cetera. The California Energy Commission, of course, has the EPIC-funded research program, and this is their research 3-year research plan that they adopted earlier this year as well, to invest about $400 million in research over the next 3 years, really looking at stages of getting from applied research and development through to the market. They have it's a very robust program rolled out through a series of RFPs, but some important topics here, a lot of the work on understanding climate impacts and the projections, building energy system resilience, so how do we make sure our energy system can withstand change that's happening, but also how can it support our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and supporting transformation of communities, and also really focused on supporting disadvantaged communities. This, again, a robust plan developed through a public process. One we haven't had a chance to really, and we actually haven't, we've been working closely with CEC on the assessment and are sitting down later this week to talk through in more detail that plan. We also will be talking in the very near future with Caltrans to understand more of their research program, but specific elements of that fall around the transportation planning program and the University of California, or the University Transportation Centers. And so better understanding that work, a lot of which does speak to, of course, sustainable transportation and community planning. But then also, Caltrans has been doing system-wide vulnerability assessments across the districts, looking at the risks that climate change pose to the state's transportation system and state-owned assets. And so that type of work, which is really part of the program, can also help to inform the research program. And then finally, California Department of Food and Agriculture, building off of the specialty crops report from 2013, which really took a nice sort of ground up look at research needs has really informed the climate smart agriculture programs, but then ongoing work, a lot of which is in pilots, and really on the ground work with healthy soils, dairy digesters, and other work. And so again, working to build off of this program as well. And then not doing it at all justice, in one slide, I've put California's universities and national labs, which is almost impossible to inventory what's going on, but I wanted to just give some examples, and we will be planning and been starting to have conversations about how to best engage the academic community. They're not a workshopping crowd typically, and so really trying to think about how do we engage them through roundtables or other types of conversations. But I think there are some really important programs, and this is, again, just a sampling, but for instance, the UC Carbon Neutrality Initiative, which is a neat program tied to carbon neutrality goals for the UC, but really with an eye towards how do they pilot and try things that they can then get out into the broader economy. And these cut across our public and private universities. Caltech is home to the Resnick Institute for Sustainability. Stanford has the Precourt Institute for Energy. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab doing just a tremendous amount of work on green buildings and energy efficiency. Citrus, the Center for Information Technology in the Interest of Society, is doing a ton of work on how to link together information technology, but just broad programs and how we link them to societal transformation. Scripps is home to the California-Nevada Climate Applications Program, which is a NOAA-funded RISA, and I apologize, I'm going to forget what that acronym stands for, so let's pretend it's a word, RISA. But that's where our climate projection data and all of that work has been coming out of Scripps, and they just launched a Center for Climate Impacts and Adaptation where they just had a new director come on board to lead that. So we just have a tremendous wealth of resources to partner with and build off of. And so we're really looking to think about how to best engage the academic community in doing this program and this work, and really thinking about how we can launch this most effectively and demonstrate the value that we can do through partnerships and doing this research. A few things just as we look at some of the gaps and opportunities. I think one of our most challenging areas, because we implement our research plan through our individual research programs, is a lot on these cross-cutting research areas. And so a couple of these that come out and that we've heard from different folks are really around land use and the intersecting role with land use in mitigation and adaptation. And then as well in this integrated climate action, I think we all talk a lot about how we're really trying to prioritize these actions that can reduce emissions and build resilience. And I think a lot more work is needed to understand how we operationalize that concept. Work in social science, understanding social and economic dimensions of climate change and climate policy, huge topic. Thinking about vulnerability, what does vulnerability mean in face of climate impacts, and things like that. And then another big, very practical gap is integrating some of our non-energy information into CalAdapt, which we currently can't do through our existing programs, because that is all CEC funded development to this point. And so it's definitely a topic we've talked a lot about in the research working group, is how do we broaden that and make that tool be able to have ag information in it, so it could be useful to a rancher or a farmer. So I guess I already talked, I think really our goals to the date have been really trying to identify gaps and think about how we could potentially fill them in our state-funded research programs. And then also how to bring in the partnerships and think about working with the academic institutions, how to build off of our existing plans and strategies. Building a research investment plan in very short order is a pretty tall task, but we have a lot of work that we can build off of. And then really how to leverage the cross-agency structure of SGC to make this program effective. So I'll just conclude. This is very much a straw man, so hopefully we'll spark some conversation of a proposed timeline, which is very ambitious. We're here today at October 23rd. By November 10th, we want to have a draft research investment plan, and so that we're working to have all these conversations across state agencies. We have a CAT research working group coming up over the month of November and maybe creeping into early December. Do engagement around this. I think there's two important components to engagement. One is to engage stakeholders and practitioners, and how can this research and this program be helpful and useful? And then how do we engage the academic community? And those are probably two different strategies. In December, I believe there's another meeting coming up. We will come back, again, as a discussion item to just update the progress where we are. December 8th, we have a meeting of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Programs Technical Advisory Council, which almost all of your state agencies participate in, but also includes practitioners, local governments, et cetera. Our goal is to be able to have a research investment plan that would also integrate guidelines for application, so make it a single document, ready to go for adoption in January. And then a lot of great things happen, and we hear a lot of wonderful ideas, and in March, we award some grants. So that's the ambitious goal, but one that we sort of lay out there for discussion and input on how we move forward with that. So thanks.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I think I'll just start because you've said so much that it's really unclear to me how you take this broad thing you just did and narrow it down to some sort of action that actually works. And the thing I was going to do as part of this is sort of just make sure I highlighted all the different things we were already doing in the agency, and you got about half of them. Because we actually do have workshops at Tahoe with a science group. That lake is heating faster than any freshwater lake in the world. That is sort of asking questions and starting to do studies on resiliency and climate. In oceans, you mentioned obviously the sea level rise work we've done. But through the Ocean Protection Council, we did whole other grants because the oceans have been, except for sea level rise, have been left out of a lot of our climate work. And we're doing the science to prove that algae and seagrasses can do sequestration. We've worked in partnership on acidification with Washington and Oregon in a major science study that does the early steps of not just what is the science and how bad is the situation, but what are the early steps of things we can do. And we also have, through the work we're trying to do modeling with the natural and working lands part of the scoping plan, have engaged the Lawrence Labs to do modeling under contract for us. And so you add that to the fourth assessment, the Energy Commission, some of the science we're doing for the forest carbon plan, some that the safeguarding plan that's coming out is based on, and the fact that we have the Ocean Science Trust. And then you went into all these other departments. That's just us. And so trying to understand how there's this broad net where you're trying to catch everything and decide where gaps are in a time frame that seems like you have to release the draft of the plan before the previous meeting is done. It looks like almost on these schedules. How are you going to truly assess what's out there through the entirety of state government on all this and decide what the gaps are? Because in many ways, we have a few gaps that we just would love to fill in our own work, but this seems so broad across both the emission side and the resiliency side. And you're right with your opening statement that 11 million doesn't get us that far. So you laid it out in words, but what really is the process for narrowing this all down and getting somewhere in a short amount of time?
You left out Fish and Wildlife and Department of Conservation, among others.
Only because we have to get out of here by 4 or 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
Because we did the science study with the oil and gas and everything else. It's all out there. So it's
Yeah.
a question of,
it's an excellent point, and it's very true. I mean, I think the 2015 research plan provides a very good foundation. It captures a lot. There is work going on right now, somewhat informally, but to try to inventory what has been completed in that plan. So that will be one piece. But I think that's really where the collaboration among all of us sitting down and identifying, so what are the gaps that resources has, that CDFA has, that Cal EPA has, how do we start to really look and think about, ideally we can demonstrate the value that an investment in research can have. And so I think it's a process of trying to inventory those gaps and think about what can be the most effective investment in a timeline that makes sense over the course of this program.
but you see, I think the 2015 plan does, the reason some of my organizations say we're going to do a strategic plan and all this stuff, and it's always a recipe for me to shoot myself, because it's generally a menu of everything that's out there with no priorities. And so that's sort of what I was asking, is like the 2015 plan, yes, that's good, but it doesn't necessarily say this is more important than this, or if there are 5 gaps, these are the 3 that we think more. What is the process for getting at that?
I mean, I think that's the internal process where we start to try to identify those priorities and what are the criteria among which how we would want to prioritize them, which most of everything we've done in the plan, in the research plan, is linked to a policy goal that we have. But I think we have to think about policy, timeline of research, readiness of research, because there's also a timeline to spend the money. So I think we have to come up with those criteria and start laying out priorities, because as you said, $11 million will only go so far. But I also think we're having input from the council on some of those priorities and what would be helpful as the body that, you all representing the broad swath of all of our agencies. I think that would be exceptionally helpful to have.
Well, there's one additional point, and maybe it's in there and I just didn't see it. And it's, if you look, for example, at what the Ocean Protection Council did with Prop 84 bond money since 2006, most of which was spent before this administration was there. It's my view that if somebody stood at a mic and said, let's do this, they voted to do it, and money just flowed out that way. And we really prioritized leveraging other money or doing matches or something that took something like $11 million and really brought more to the table. Is that something that's going to be part of this, that sort of one factor in making a decision is whether or not it leverages other things to get to a broader result?
I think it can be. I mean, I think that's an important point for discussion. I think there's all kinds of criteria that we could lay out, that would go into the guidelines part, and I think leverage is certainly one.
And I might just add to that briefly. So, absolutely part of it, just to kind of put a point here on the process once again, just kind of got authority for the program, but really the purpose of today is to try to first lay out the state of the research, hear more about priorities from you all. But then when we do come back on December and we actually have a draft, I think you can anticipate seeing we've gone out with at least some public process to get input on that draft. Much more of a refinement of priorities and what those gaps are between amongst our agency partners and departments that we'll speak to. So that's definitely coming. We, by statute, have to develop first, though, a research investment plan and then go out with competitive grants. And so we're trying to shorten that as much as possible. But I think when we do come back in December, that's when you can see a refinement in priorities that, again, we're going to recommend to you all.
Let me make a couple
Thank you. For me, I appreciate the
couple of comments. First, as you can tell by Louise's presentation, we've been thinking about this for a while. Maybe not as in a focused kind of way as we need to, but you can tell from the CAT research group that we are trying to be coherent across multiple agencies and multiple efforts. I can also tell you that we've had some proposals from universities that are very concerned that they're losing federal funding. And they want to make it up in part through the state, and they think they need hundreds of millions of dollars annually to do it. So $10 million, you know, this is not going to change the world. So the question is what to do with $10 million. And as Louise says, you know, we should, as a council, think through what $10 million might be able to do. For my own part, and this is something that Louise and I have talked about, you know, I think that we could focus a fair amount of attention on identifying the top priorities and how to move them more quickly. And I see that as an applied science kind of approach. That's something where I think we might get foundation input, we might get university input, and find some other sources of funding as well, kind of along the lines, John, of what you were saying. So I just throw that out because I think $10 million, you know, in this realm is just not going to be world changing unless we really focus it. So yeah, Manuel.
So as an academic researcher, a couple of things. This timeline is quite aggressive. I think it'd be hard to get an email return from my colleagues before November 10th. And second, I understand the issue you were saying about doing workshops. It said about the academy that it's all stars and no constellation. So I think getting people to work together will be a challenge. I wonder what it's one thing to identify gaps, and then it's another to sort of say, what's the SGC niche? And what are the particular things that we're sort of investing in where research would be helpful? And to me, when I go at it that way, it sort of narrows things down a little bit. And it's not an exclusive list, but for example, what's the relationship between changing land use and changing behavior? We're very interested in whether or not the investments we're making in land use changes wind up changing behavior and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think there's a big concern right now about whether or not the push that we're contributing to with regard to compact development and transit-oriented communities is producing gentrification and displacement. Is it? How do we measure it? What's the best science about that, et cetera? I think that we are perhaps better than almost any other group that's spending the GHG funds, very concerned about making sure that those dollars get to the communities that are identified as being the most exposed and socially vulnerable. So what's the environmental justice cut on some particular set of issues? So I would just that might be workforce, that might be something else. I think that speaks to sort of what we're doing. I would encourage in the next 10 days, I guess before Halloween, you have to have a plan. It'll be hopefully not a frightening plan, but to really start thinking about what it is that SGC is doing and investing in, and what's that particular niche where we actually need more applied science kind of from good research work. That's kind of a different way than saying this is the landscape and there's a lot of gaps, because but saying within those gaps, what's our particular thing that we're doing?
Could somebody put this in context for me? How did this happen? Why did we get $10 million? What was the intention of it? And why are we on a timeline that everybody feels is unrealistic?
So the timeline is, because we need to get dollars out the door and show results. So that's the
and why do
problem.
The urgency in getting dollars out the door is because?
Well, I mean, there is climate change.
I realize that, but a couple of months, 3 months is not going to probably have an impact on that.
Well, true enough, but it's also the case that we need to report back to the legislature, and these things come up at a regular basis.
I mean, every time we're given money, we rush to get it out the door.
That's true.
I mean, I've been here for 8 years, and it just seems like we're on a bit of a cycle that instead of doing things, I mean, on the one hand, it's such a small amount of money relative to some of the other things we're doing. We should get this done quickly. On the other hand, we want to do it wisely so that we're not, regardless of how much we're spending, so we're not looking like we're spending taxpayers' money in a foolish way. So,
if I can take a stab at Bob's question, as maybe the only former legislator sitting at the dais, I think that a lot of times the legislature wants to have answers before they have to draft bills or put together a budget in the next session, and that dictates the timeliness of it. And if it turns out we're going to identify a lot of gaps and a lot of needs, it's against that deadline that they're operating, and the fact that it might put us behind the 8 ball and doing something that seems too quick or faster than normally would be, I think those are the driving factors.
And I will say this wasn't, what's that? Yeah, I was about to comment on that, that it was not something the SGC sought at a staff level or from me. And so it was something of a surprise that we received this funding, but we were not privy to some of those negotiations. Randall, do you want to add anything?
That does not happen to me all the time, but congratulations to us. So, but I do think, given that, do we have a sense of the intentions of the authors of the legislation about what issues they thought were going to be addressed and why they would have given it to SGC? I guess I'm making up the idea that they thought we're filling a particular niche and those areas might need more research.
I mean, I can speak to that a bit, at least to the extent to which I know, and I definitely don't have a full picture of all that went into the formation of the legislative language and what we got. So maybe I'll just walk through the timeline, and we're still having conversations. So you might recall that earlier in August, as legislative discussions were picking up, in the governor's office proposed budget for cap and trade funding, there was a line item for research. It was research directly for the UCs, the UC school system, for climate change research, but not much more details beyond that. Then came negotiations with the legislature. Again, was not privy to those discussions. From what I understand, there were a number of perspectives that weighed into forming the legislative language, not all of which are resolved, or I think result in kind of a clear direction, which is why you sort of see the discussion that we're having now and the sort of process of identifying priorities. But a few things did kind of come out, I think. One, an interest in having a competitive program. So going through the process of establishing criteria in a public manner, and not just limiting that funding to the UCs. There was also, I think, an indication or interest in having the funds run through a body such as this. And a body made up of multiple perspectives, both agencies and the public. I believe that in the legislature, I think on the assembly side, there was even discussion of forming another committee. But then folks said, well, actually a committee exists. It's called the SGC. I'm still having discussions, though, with the governor's office, with our agencies, our partner agencies, and certainly with the legislature to better understand those priorities as we develop the program. But it's not my sense that there was sort of one, clear charge as to how the program should be developed, other than the direction of you all.
I mean, I would only also add that, while Louise's presentation covered research that's currently going on by institutions within the state of California, there are plenty of accredited other institutions that are also doing research, and we wouldn't want to duplicate those either. And so, we need to look at that as well, because to do something that New York University is doing and do exactly the same as they are would be a waste of money. So I think Manuel asked a good question, which is, what are we particularly good at? And what is our niche? How can we add value into this whole landscape? But we kind of need to do a landscape analysis of all the work that's getting done, or we're going to just be throwing money after things that have already been analyzed.
So, Matt, I'll get to you in 1 second. We do have the climate action team research group, which Louise is part of, and they are obviously really important to this and have done a fair amount of this evaluation. So that will help. Matt?
Yeah, I'll just say that the need to spend the money quickly, I think, has been highlighted by the fact that during the course of this administration, or this discussion rather, I should say, we've gone from having $11 million to $10 million. So you just need to spend the money quickly, otherwise we'll lose it. I was just wondering, Louise, do we have a sense of how many grants we're talking about here, or is there a typical grant? I mean, it seems like we're going to need some information about how many grants are we looking at here, what's typical, and also I'd be very interested, we just spent a great deal of time talking about whether we should spend 5 to 10% on community outreach and engagement, and I'm concerned, having seen university grants before, that we could use up all the funding in administrative overhead. So I don't know how we're going to address that issue. That will really start diminishing the $11 million as well. So I don't know if you've given that some thought.
Yeah, we
Matt,
have.
can I piggyback on that and answer at the same time? We're talking about the urgency of our getting them out, but what is the expectation on when that will produce a result? Like, what are they going to report on and to whom and how soon? So to just piggyback on Matt's, thanks.
The overhead question, yes, we have been talking about, we've had conversations with ARB, and I know Liz Grassi has been looking into this as well and trying to think about how we minimize that, how much that takes away, because it could be a lot, especially universities are one thing, national labs are not, I mean, it's a lot. So that will definitely be something. In terms of the number of grants, I think that's an excellent question and probably a point for discussion. And maybe, as we start doing this landscape analysis, because, you look at the fourth climate change assessment, and I think I said we have about 35 studies, that was about a $10 million investment. And so those are smaller, some of those studies are under $100,000 and some are, but they're in that range. But then of course, there are projects where we could do an applied field study involving satellites and all this, and someone actually has given us a proposal that is $10 million. So I think we can fall, and then we could do, then of course there's stuff that costs a lot more than that. So I think it becomes a real question of the type of research we're trying to talk about doing. And so if it is, so some of the less expensive items in the fourth climate change assessment are things like technical reviews or, as opposed to going out into the field and doing work on the ground. And so I think it's going to be an important area for discussion from an administrative point of view in terms of trying to get rapid results and do all of that. I don't know what the right answer is there, but administering 35 grants is a lot more work than a handful of larger grants. So anyway, those are, I think, all questions. In terms of the timeline, the money needs to be, and I'm going to look to Liz and Randall, it's 2019. Everything needs to be spent. So that's pretty rapid turnaround, which also relates to the size of the grant. How much money can you spend in what amount of time? And so I think these are all really important questions. The other factor that fits into that is the timeline that we would be asking researchers to put together a proposal. And I'm sure, Manuel and probably others could speak to this, but putting together a large collaborative proposal over the course of a month is impossible, I would say. So these are all factors I think we have to think about as we move forward. And I don't know if right now we don't have really enough information to say what the right answer is, but does that help?
It does help. I'm just trying to get a sense of what we'll be looking at when you come back to us in December and what I should be thinking about, and whether there's any direction we can give you at this point in time, because this is a very ambitious schedule. And if you come back to us with something and we've collectively got different ideas about what this should look like, that will put us in a difficult situation. I think you're hearing some ideas here about, okay, we've got a sense of we need to spend the money by 2019, has to be done quickly. I think we want to maximize the result. It needs to be something, an area where we think we need to prioritize right now because this is information that we need now. And I think Manuel brought up a very good point when you talked about, think about also your audience here and the Strategic Growth Council and what we do and what's within our expertise. I'm going to have some difficulty on making a decision on a very, very heavy science-laden, perhaps, proposal that might be better directed to the Energy Commission or somebody like the scientific review panels that are out there. So just to keep that in mind, it's what can we do quickly? What will be very helpful to us as we're moving ahead, and looking at some of the existing literature out there and identifying those gaps that sort of fit into that, and also what can we afford? Because, yeah, $11 million is it's not quite budget dust, but it's pretty close. So those just some thoughts as we're thinking about how we're going to get this done. And we'll look forward to working with you in the next couple of weeks to give you some additional ideas if we come up with them at Cal EPA.
Great.
Yeah, I'd like to see the various agencies, have, 2 or 3 priorities that they think a quick infusion of research dollars might make a significant difference on the issue of climate in some form. I think that would be really great. Manuel?
So a couple of things. One is having done work with ARB and Cal EPA, both while I was at UC and then at USC. The arrangement with UC anyway actually tends to bring the overhead charges to pretty reasonable amounts, and in some sense there's a bias toward moving to the state universities and UCs because of you're going to get much more bang for your buck. Second, I do think this idea of what fits our agenda would be really important, and if it's permissible or within the guidelines, I'm pretty sure I'm completely ineligible to apply for this because of being on the Strategic Growth Council. So I'd be completely open to having a conversation in the next couple of weeks about what I think people are doing that might fit with this. I don't want to be the only voice that does it, but having interface between the agencies. And so, for example, we did a lot of work on the equity dimensions of cap and trade. That's pretty interesting. ARB, that's not really an SGC kind of thing. So kind of maybe I'd be quite willing to be in that. We might need to get clearance about whether it's okay for me to bring in that conversation for Brown Act reasons and other reasons, but I'm sure I can't apply, so damn it.
The Transportation Agency has been doing some additional considerations on research in the last year because we had some one-time money in the 2016 budget, and then with Senate Bill 1, there's an ongoing amount of new research money that's $5 million for the UCs and $2 million for the CSUs. But it's interesting, there's various models, and it sounds like what the SGC's staff are contemplating here is a bit of a hybrid. We have some research where Caltrans will develop a very detailed scope of work because they have a specific need, and they'll almost open that up for proposals to fulfill that specific need. There's other proposals where with the universities we agree on some priority focus areas, and then the UC comes back to us with some of their proposals on how they might accomplish that. Now with this structure, it sounds like it's again a hybrid where the council may have some priority topic areas, but you'll leave it for the universities to come in and maybe talk about how their approach may be best to make progress toward the goals or the focus areas. The other thing that we're trying to do more is have a specific state agency sponsor that follows the research as it progresses. So when we've done this in the last year, we've had the Air Resources Board has been part of this group, the Energy Commission. And so every research project that the UCs have come in with, we've assigned a state department and then an individual at a state department who, in theory, has at least 3 touch points with the research. One, when they get the team together and they're doing the more defined activity before they get going, sort of in the middle, and then at the end when they're drawing conclusions. And I think that that's helpful in the sense of maybe flagging some issues along the way. If we talked about practical research, but there's some ideas about whether the research will result in a recommendation, whether it's purely gathering data and sharing that data. And it seems that embed of a state partner along the way, I think has potential to be helpful and maybe something you want to consider in the draft research investment plan to see if there's some way you can articulate that as a model.
Okay.
If I could just add,
Yeah, Mike.
and I appreciate everything that's been said. I pretty much agree with, and also the approach you're taking with the gap analysis and trying to leverage and work across different agencies. Just with the gap analysis, my only suggestion would be, in addition to identifying where there's complete gaps in research, where has adequate research or a lot of research been conducted, and then there's a breakdown at the implementation portion. So where there's not across but down, I guess, is the way I would visualize that. And it gets to land use, and I think the conferences I attend, there's plenty of research on the densification of land use and transit-oriented development. Then there's a lot of finger pointing at local government. This is where I put on my city manager hat, where we've fallen down on the job, or local councils have fallen down or succumbed to the NIMBYism. And I think there's plenty of room for research and real science behind what happens when the best research that's out there doesn't actually get implemented, and what causes that breakdown.
Okay, we have a couple of public comments on this item. So Jeannie Merrill, followed by Cindy Blaine.
Thank you. Jeannie Merrill with the California Climate and Agriculture Network. We're very glad to see SGC engaging in the question of climate change research needs, and agree with many of the comments made today about the need for applied research when it comes to adaptation and resiliency issues, as well as some of the clean energy work. There have been many plans that address our interests around agricultural adaptation resiliency needs that have been very important. But we haven't gotten yet to the level of understanding of what's needed on the ground from farmers and ranchers, and how to make climate change adaptation a part of ongoing conservation and business planning, to really train up our technical service providers who work directly with farmers and ranchers on these questions, the resource conservation districts, UC Extension, et cetera. Focusing the research plan on that applied research, I think, could really help with that and also provide a niche, help fill a gap. And it's going to take longer than March to get there in terms of building those proposals. And we understand the conundrum of sort of wanting to make the case to the legislature about the value of these funds, and would suggest moving the timeline from March to May. That still gives you time, I think, to get some good proposals in where we're asking researchers to think a little bit differently, to think with collaborators like farmers and ranchers or RCDs or Extension when thinking about the ag research, but thinking about community partners on the urban side as well. And the May timeframe is still very relevant in the legislature in terms of budget debates. So you can say by May we got X number of proposals, and I'm pretty sure you're going to get more proposals than you can fund, just given the demands out there. But really moving that timeline, making the research relevant, and also thinking about, it's a new day somewhat with AB 398, and we can think more creatively and innovatively in terms of bringing together mitigation and adaptation. How do some of our existing programs, like the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, like Healthy Soils, like many of the climate change research program, or investment programs rather, also speak to or can speak to adaptation needs. What are the adaptive benefits of healthy soils, of farmland conservation, et cetera? I think there's a lot of good on-the-ground work that we can do, but we do need to give researchers plus collaborators time to figure out those proposals in a meaningful way while still making the case to the legislature that these funds are worthwhile. Thanks.
Thank you. Cindy?
Hi, I'm Cindy Blaine with California Relief. As you may know, California Relief is the umbrella organization for nonprofits, urban forest nonprofits that plant and care for trees throughout our state in urban areas. We were talking about various things here. We've been talking about land use. We've been talking about impact. 95% of the population lives in urban areas. And one of our concerns right now is are the varying pressures on the urban land use, such as compact development, and then, of course, water. As we saw 2 years ago when we had the drought, we told people to turn off the water. That's had long-term impacts for the last 2 years. I just got another email from somebody in Fullerton saying that people took out large trees because they thought they were saving water. If we're talking about having walkable cities and active transportation, if we're talking about having cities that we can actually go outside when the temperature gets hotter, we have to have urban greening and urban trees. And so that is what I would like some research to be directed to. And some of it is very pragmatic and very practical and could be done through, we have actually somebody from the U.S. Forest Service here, Josh Wilson with the Urban Ecosystems and Social Dynamics Group. That's the group that Greg McPherson, who's done the work on carbon sequestration, is with. So we absolutely need the protective values of trees, and there's 3 things that we have kind of in mind right off the bat, and that is, how much water do trees really need? We told people to turn off the water. People have been overwatering their lawns for years in California, but what do we need to make sure that we get rid of the lawns, have drought-tolerant shrubbery, but still have enough water for trees so that you can walk outside when it gets hotter? So we have a lot of research, for example, on how much water fruit trees use in California because of the industry, because of the almond industry, because of the fruit industry, but we don't have that much about cityscapes. The other thing that we need is to talk about large trees, and this gets back to footprint and land use again. Everybody, there's a lot of talk about drought-tolerant trees, but a lot of times what that means is a stunted kind of bonsai tree that doesn't have any benefits. The benefits for humans is in large trees. And so we need to be looking at new trees that are water-wise, water-friendly, rather than drought-tolerant. And as you know, any tree is going to take some investment of water to reach its size, but there are some that are better once they get big, such as native oaks. Maybe even considering eucalyptus from Australia, which has been going through some of this already. And lastly, how do we incorporate high-tech and innovation into the sensors? Because right now, people just turn on the water and, it turns off in 15 minutes, and who knows what that does. But there's sensor technology happening that's in either the earth or it's in the air. How can we do that? So in our mind, there's a lot of areas for pragmatic research right now to make sure that 95% of the population is living in a place that's healthy and viable. We're doing a great job talking about planting trees in Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, but we need to do some research to back it up and make it stronger. Thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments? All right. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.